In the heart of the galactic diplomatic chamber, the soft hum of advanced technology mingled with the lively conversations of beings from across the stars. Representatives from countless alien civilizations floated, hovered, or strode across the crystalline floor, each species uniquely adapted to its corner of the universe. The chamber itself was a marvel, glimmering with holographic displays that shimmered like constellations, casting an ethereal glow on the dignitaries below. Today's agenda was a routine discussion of Earth's integration into the Galactic Alliance, a matter most species regarded as an amusing curiosity rather than a serious issue. Earth, with its young history of space exploration, was a newcomer among the stars. Humans, by comparison, seemed almost laughably primitive. As the alien representatives gathered, there was an air of thinly veiled amusement, a sentiment that quickly became the unspoken theme of the meeting. Ambassador Shrill, a creature with translucent tentacles that pulsed gently as if in rhythm with his thoughts, floated to the center of the chamber. His speech synthesizer emitted a voice that managed to sound both serene and faintly patronizing. "And now," he began, his tentacles curling slightly, "we discuss the matter of humans." The word humans rolled out of his synthesizer with a tone one might use to describe an endearing but slightly clueless pet. The gathered representatives erupted into chittering laughter, their own ways of expressing amusement filling the space. A towering insectoid diplomat with gleaming compound eyes clicked his mandibles together in a way that could only be interpreted as a mocking grin. Yes," he said, his voice clicking through a translator, "the bipedal creatures who still celebrate their modest achievements in faster-than-light travel. How quaint." From above, Council Member Pix, a bird-like alien with a feathered crest that shimmered in hues of blue and gold, descended gracefully to join the conversation. Her feathers flared in excitement as she added, "Did you know they still use projectile weapons? Actual physical projectiles. Can you imagine?" Her words sent another wave of laughter rippling through the crowd. The banter continued, with holographic displays projecting images of human technology. Representatives chuckled as they discussed nuclear energy, Earth's rudimentary spacecraft, and what they called childish human inventions. "They're proud of their nuclear fusion," mused Ambassador Atrell, "a crystalline entity that radiated light with every word. Shall we tell them we used that for recreational cooking years ago?" The doors to the chamber slid open with a soft hiss, the sound almost imperceptible amid the laughter. A human male stepped inside, his polished black boots clicking sharply against the pristine floor. The figure, dressed in the formal uniform of the United Earth Coalition, carried himself with the kind of calm confidence that suggested he had seen more than he let on. His name tag read James Rodriguez, and beneath it, a smaller designation, *** Human Military Liaison ***. The chamber quieted slightly, but the undertone of condescension lingered. Ambassador Shrill's tentacles rippled in what he believed was a welcoming gesture. The human representative," he announced, his voice imbued with faint amusement. "We were just discussing your species' impressive technological achievements." James didn't react immediately. His calm, steady gaze swept across the room, taking in the array of alien diplomats. Then he smiled, not the polite, rehearsed smile typical of most human diplomats, but something warmer, more disarming, and just faintly mischievous. It was the kind of smile that suggested he knew something no one else did. Council Member Pix fluttered closer, her curiosity piqued. "You served in your military, didn't you?" she asked, her crest rising slightly. "Tell us, what is it like using such traditional weapons?" James tilted his head, his smile broadening ever so slightly. 15 years in the Marine Corps," he said, his voice even and unhurried. 3 campaigns, plenty of stories, but you know, what's really interesting?" His gaze flicked from one alien to the next. "Not one of you has asked why humans have so many rules about how we fight wars." The chamber fell into an uneasy silence. Tentacles stilled, feathers flattened, and compound eyes blinked in unison. The light-hearted mockery that had filled the room moments before was now replaced with a tension that no one could quite place. Ambassador Shrill's tentacles wavered slightly. "Rules for warfare," he echoed, his voice faltering. "What an odd concept. Why would a species need rules for such a primitive form of conflict resolution?" James leaned casually against the central platform, his relaxed posture somehow amplifying the unease among the gathered representatives. "Funny story," he began, his tone light. "Turns out we humans got a little too good at finding creative ways to kill each other. So we had to set some boundaries, for safety's sake." Several diplomats exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier amusement now replaced with a flicker of apprehension. Creative ways? Ambassador Cray, the insectoid diplomat, asked, his mandibles clicking nervously. James's smile widened just enough to be noticeable. "Oh yeah. And if you're interested, I'd be happy to explain why we had to ban certain weapons and tactics. It's quite a history lesson." The room was silent now, the kind of silence that felt heavier than noise. Even the holographic displays seemed to dim slightly, as if unwilling to compete with the tension that had gripped the chamber. "Should we start with basic war crimes?" James suggested, his voice breaking the silence like a clap of thunder. "Or should I jump straight to the really interesting stuff that made us write new laws?" Ambassador Srill's tentacles twitched involuntarily, their translucent glow dimming. "Perhaps," he stammered, "you could elaborate on the rules. A brief summary, perhaps." James chuckled softly, his laughter unsettlingly warm and genuine. "Sure thing," he said, pulling a sleek datapad from his pocket. "Let's start with why we had to ban white phosphorus. That one's always a crowd pleaser." As the alien diplomats leaned in, their initial curiosity now tinged with palpable dread, James tapped on his datapad. "Oh," he added casually, "you might want to take notes. This might change how you think about humans." The chamber hum on his every word, the air heavy with suspense, as James prepared to reveal the darker, unspoken truths of humanity's past. James stood in the center of the galactic diplomatic chamber, the weight of countless alien stares pressing in on him. Their curiosity was now laced with apprehension, and some even with fear. His casual demeanor seemed to disarm them, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. This wasn't just a meeting anymore. It had become something more significant, a revelation that no one in the room had expected. He raised the datapad slightly, letting its sleek surface catch the ambient light of the chamber. "Before we dive in, let me set the stage for you," he began, his voice calm but with a weight that carried across the room. "Humanity's history is messy. We're a species of contradictions. Brilliant and brutal, compassionate and ruthless. And when it comes to war, well, we learn to innovate." The chamber remained deathly quiet. Ambassador Srill's tentacles coiled tighter, his translucent glow dimming further as James's words hung in the air. The others looked similarly uneasy, their body language betraying the same discomfort. It wasn't just the words. It was the way James said them, like he was peeling back a layer of truth they hadn't been prepared to see. "Let's talk about the concept of war crimes," James continued, pacing slowly now, his boots clicking softly against the crystalline floor. "It's a term we came up with to describe the worst of the worst. Things so terrible that even in the chaos of war, we decided there had to be lines. Lines you don't cross, no matter what." He stopped, turning to face the assembly. "But here's the thing," he said, his voice dropping just slightly, forcing them to lean in. "The only reason we had to make those rules was because we broke them." Repeatedly. A murmur rippled through the crowd, soft but unmistakable. The insectoid diplomat, Ambassador Cray, shifted uncomfortably, his mandibles clicking in a way that suggested nervousness. The crystalline entity, Atril, dimmed their internal light even further, as if trying to disappear into the background. Even the ever-composed council member Pix fluttered her feathers nervously, her usual elegance faltering. James let the silence settle before continuing. "Take white phosphorus, for example," he said, holding up the datapad. With a flick of his finger, a holographic display appeared, showing a simulation of a small, glowing incendiary burst. "This stuff burns so hot it doesn't just scorch, it eats through flesh, bone, and anything else in its path. We used it to light up battlefields, sure, but it did a lot more than that." The image shifted, showing a barren landscape covered in smoldering craters. James's tone didn't change, but his words carried a gravity that pressed down on the room like a weight. "We learned quickly how devastating it could be, and not just to enemy forces. Civilians, children, entire towns caught in the crossfire. The stuff doesn't care who you are or where you stand, it just burns. Ambassador Strull's voice broke the silence, trembling slightly as he asked, And you banned this weapon?" James nodded, though there was no triumph in his expression. "Eventually. After we'd already used it enough to realize the cost wasn't worth the tactical advantage." His gaze swept the room again, meeting the eyes or equivalent sensory organs of each alien present. "That's the thing about humans. We don't always figure out the right thing to do until after we've done the wrong thing first." The weight of his words settled over the chamber like a storm cloud. The aliens, so accustomed to thinking of humans as harmless, were now confronted with a truth they hadn't anticipated. James wasn't boasting, and he wasn't defending humanity's actions. He was simply laying it out, piece by piece, and the reality was unsettling. "You might think it strange," James continued, his voice softer now, "that a species would create rules for something as chaotic as war. But you have to understand, we've been fighting each other for so long, we had to find a way to make it manageable. Otherwise, we would have wiped ourselves out centuries ago." He paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to keep them on edge. "And yet, even with rules, we've come close. Too close. Nuclear weapons, biological agents, chemical warfare, we've dabbled in all of it. Every time we learned the hard way that some things should never be used." The crystalline entity, Atrill, finally spoke, their voice a melodic hum that wavered slightly. "Why would your species develop such weapons if you knew their consequences?" James considered the question for a moment before answering. "Desperation. Fear. Power. Take your pick. Sometimes it's all of the above. Humans don't always think about the long-term consequences when survival is on the line. And sometimes we're just not as smart as we think we are." Another murmur spread through the room, this one quieter but no less tense. The aliens were beginning to see humanity in a different light, not as the harmless, primitive species they'd mocked earlier, but as something far more complex. James took a step closer to the center, his voice steady but growing firmer. "But here's the part you need to understand. We don't just make these rules for ourselves, we enforce them. And when someone breaks them, we hold them accountable. That's the difference between chaos and civilization, even in war." His words carried a quiet power, and the room seemed to shrink around him. The alien diplomats, so confident moments ago, now seemed small, their laughter and condescension a distant memory. "Of course," James added, his tone taking on a faint edge, "not everyone follows the rules. There are always those who think they can get away with anything if the stakes are high enough. And when that happens," he trailed off, letting the sentence hang in the air. Council member Pix tilted her head, her feathers shifting uneasily. "And when that happens," she prompted, her voice softer than before. James met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "When that happens, we find them. And we stop them, no matter the cost." The silence that followed was heavier than anything James had said. The aliens, for all their advanced technology and wisdom, were grappling with something they hadn't expected. The idea that humanity's strength wasn't in its weapons or its technology, but in its relentless determination. Finally, Ambassador Strull spoke, his voice hesitant. "You said there were other examples, other reasons you created these rules. Perhaps you could enlighten us further." James's smile returned, faint and without humor. "Oh, I've got plenty of stories," he said, his tone deceptively light. "But let's start with something a little closer to home. Ever heard of something called nerve gas?" The room seemed to collectively hold its breath, the tension so thick it was almost tangible. The holographic displays flickered, casting shifting shadows across the chamber as James prepared to reveal another chapter of humanity's dark and complicated history. James paused, letting the tension stretch thin across the room, watching as the alien representatives exchanged uneasy glances. The word nerve gas clearly hit a nerve, even among species who likely had no equivalent. For a moment, the Marine simply stood there, hands resting on his hips, a quiet authority radiating from his stance. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he dismissed the hologram and started pacing again, his boots clicking steadily against the crystalline floor. "Nerve gas," he began, his voice calm but carrying a weight that couldn't be ignored, "is one of the most insidious weapons humans ever created. You don't see it, you don't smell it, but the moment it touches your skin or you breathe it in, it shuts you down fast. It targets the nervous system, turning your own body against you. Muscles seize, lungs stop working, and he let the sentence trail off, the grim conclusion left unspoken but vividly clear. The insectoid diplomat, Ambassador Cray, clicked his mandibles nervously. "Your species use this?" he asked, his voice a mixture of disbelief and unease. James stopped pacing and turned to face him. "Used it?" "Yeah, we've used it. Not often and not for a while now, but it's there in our history. And every time, we learned just how far-reaching the consequences could be. It's not a weapon you can control, not really. Wind shifts, people panic, and suddenly, it's not just soldiers on the battlefield who are suffering, it's anyone caught in the wrong place at the wrong time." Ambassador Shrill's translucent glow dimmed further, his tentacles curling inward, as if trying to shield himself from the implications of James's words. The crystalline Etril remained silent, their faceted bodies shimmering faintly as if absorbing the gravity of the conversation. "But here's where it gets tricky," James continued, his tone growing sharper. "Even when we knew how devastating it was, some people still thought it was worth using. Wars have a way of pushing people to justify the unjustifiable. And that's where the rules come in. Not because we're perfect, but because we've seen what happens when there aren't any rules." Council member Pix fluttered her feathers, her voice hesitant but determined. "And when these rules are broken, what happens then? How does your species respond?" James's expression darkened, and for a moment he seemed to wrestle with the weight of his answer. "When the rules are broken," he said slowly, "it's not just a crime, it's a betrayal of everything we'd fought to build. And we don't let it slide. Whether it's a rogue soldier, a rogue nation, or even a hold-then system, we'd hunt them down. We hold them accountable. Because if we don't, those lines we drew might as well not exist." The room fell silent again, the air heavy with unspoken questions and growing unease. The aliens, for all their advanced technology and interstellar wisdom, were struggling to comprehend the sheer complexity of humanity. They'd come into this meeting expecting to see a species barely out of its infancy, harmless and naive. Instead, they were being confronted with a species that had not only mastered destruction, but had also spent centuries wrestling with its consequences. Atril finally broke the silence, their melodic voice tinged with uncertainty. "But why create such things in the first place? Why not focus your efforts on peace, on harmony, instead of this?" James gave a faint, humorless smile. "You think we haven't tried?" he asked, his voice carrying a faint edge. "We've had our share of peace movements, treaties, alliances, you name it. And sometimes they work. For a while. But the thing about humans is, we're not all on the same page. We're a species of individuals with different beliefs, priorities, and ideas about what's right and wrong. And when those differences clash, sometimes it leads to conflict." He stepped closer to the center of the chamber, his gaze sweeping over the assembled diplomats. "But don't mistake that for us being purely destructive. Because here's the other side of the coin, we're survivors. Innovators. When things get tough, we adapt. When we make mistakes, we learn from them. And when we're pushed to the brink, we find ways to come back stronger." Pix tilted her head, her feathers shifting slightly. "And yet, your history is filled with such violence. How can you reconcile that with the idea of progress?" James's expression softened, though his tone remained steady. "Because progress isn't clean," he said. "It's messy, and it's hard, and sometimes it comes at a cost. But that's what makes it worth fighting for. Every time we've fallen, we've picked ourselves back up. And every time, we've tried to do better." The chamber remained silent, the weight of James's words pressing down on everyone present. The aliens, for all their advancements and experience, were beginning to see humanity in a new light, not as a primitive, inconsequential species, but as one capable of great resilience and complexity. But just as the tension seemed to reach its peak, a sharp chime echoed through the chamber. The holographic display flickered back to life, showing a new image, an alien planet, scarred and battered, its surface dotted with craters and smoldering ruins. The assembled diplomats turned toward the display, their expressions shifting from curiosity to alarm. James frowned, stepping closer to the projection. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. Ambassador Shrill's glow brightened slightly, his tentacles twitching nervously. This is a planet in the outer territories," he said, his voice trembling. a disputed region contested by several factions. We received this report just before the meeting began. The image shifted, zooming in on a cluster of buildings that had been reduced to rubble. Even from the still images, it was clear that whatever had happened, there hadn't been a natural disaster. James's jaw tightened as he studied the destruction, his mind already racing with possibilities. "Looks like more than just a dispute," he said grimly. "What happened here?" Srill hesitated, his glow dimming again. We're not certain, but the level of destruction suggests something new, something we haven't seen before." James's gaze narrowed, his instincts kicking into overdrive. This wasn't just a diplomatic meeting anymore. It was the start of something far more dangerous. And as the holographic display flickered again, showing a new set of coordinates, James knew one thing for certain. Whatever was coming next, it was going to test humanity and the entire galaxy in ways no one was prepared for.